Welcome to this week's Bible Topics discussion. It's good to have you back. Today's discussion is about divorce. Wait. I know some of you don't want to hear this, but this is God's Word. We ask your forgiveness if we offend anyone. However, this is God's words, not our words.
Wow.
Yep.
Let's look at what God's Word says, starting in Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 12. He says, "Some Pharisees came and tested him," Jesus, by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" Jesus replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." Jesus replied, "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." When Jesus and his disciples were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, "Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery."
Well, Jesus was pretty clear as to what happens to a man or woman who divorces their spouse and then remarries. God's Word repeats this several times. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 31-32, Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9, and Luke 16, verse 18. You know, we've said this before, that if God's Word has repeated it that many times, it means that we need to pay attention to it. What is so bad is that His Word is meant for believers, and according to statistics, the rate of divorce is about the same for Christians as non-Christians. And according to God's Word, if a divorced person remarries, then they are committing adultery. And so is the person they marry. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 16, the Apostle Paul begins talking about married couples that were unbelievers when they were married, but later one became a believer.
Paul says, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I am not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she's willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he's willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they're holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?"
In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17, the Apostle Paul continues by saying, "Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches." So, is a divorce between two unbelievers allowed? Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, this, "I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery." So how can we sum all this up for believers and non-believers? If you are married and divorce your spouse and remarry, then you are committing adultery, unless your spouse has committed sexual immorality. Does it mean that I must divorce my spouse for sexual immorality? No. God does not like divorce for any reason. If the one that commits sexual immorality repents, the spouse should forgive them, just as their Father in heaven forgives them. And the marriage should be reconciled. If the marriage does end in divorce, the offended spouse should forgive the spouse that committed the sexual immorality. Forgiveness is required by God.
Yes, it is. Well, that's it for this week. Please prayerfully consider our message today. God tells us that when a man and a woman marry, then they become one flesh. They are no longer two, but one flesh. Divorce damages both parties, and if children are involved, it becomes even worse. We love you all. Contact us with any questions you may have, and please like, comment, and share.
See you next week. Be blessed.